The Pacific Ocean, December 1942. While most people back home were decorating Christmas trees and singing carols, thousands of miles away, beneath the dark waters of the South China Sea, a young machinist's mate was about to change the course of naval warfare with nothing more than a wrench, some grease, and what his commanding officer initially called the most ridiculous idea he'd ever heard. If you're enjoying this story of ingenuity and courage from World War II, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories from history. Petty Officer James Henderson had never imagined himself as someone who would make history. He was from a small town in Ohio called Marietta, tucked along the banks of the Muskingum River. The son of a factory worker and a schoolteacher, James grew up with grease under his fingernails and books under his pillow. His father worked the night shift at the paper mill, coming home each morning with tired eyes and hands that trembled from years of operating heavy machinery. His mother taught third grade at the elementary school down the street, instilling in him a love of learning and a belief that problems always had solutions if you looked hard enough. When he enlisted in the Navy in the spring of 1940, Europe was already at war, but America still clung to neutrality. James was 19 years old, fresh out of high school, where he'd spent more time in the machine shop than in any other classroom. His shop teacher, Mr. Peterson, a veteran of the First World War, had pulled him aside the week before graduation. "Henderson, you've got a gift with machines. They speak to you in a way they don't speak to most people. Don't waste it." James had taken those words to heart. When the Navy recruiter came to Marietta that summer, speaking of adventure and purpose, James saw his chance. His mother cried when he told her he'd signed up. His father shook his hand and said simply, "Make us proud, son." The submarine service wasn't his first choice. In fact, he'd hoped for surface ships, destroyers maybe, or cruisers, something with room to move and sky overhead. But after scoring exceptionally high on mechanical aptitude tests at boot camp, a lieutenant commander had approached him. "Son, we need men like you underwater. The submarine service is where you can make the biggest difference." James had learned about submarines in class, steel tubes that dove beneath the waves, hunting enemy ships while trying not to become prey themselves. The thought terrified him. But he'd joined to serve, and serve he would. He found himself assigned to the submarine school in New London, Connecticut, where the Long Island Sound stretched cold and grey beyond the base. Those first weeks at submarine school tested every man differently. Some couldn't handle the claustrophobia, the knowledge that you'd be sealed in a metal tube hundreds of feet below the surface with no way out. Others struggled with the endless technical training, the systems within systems, the thousands of things that could go wrong. James found that he loved it. The complexity of the machinery, the way every system interconnected, the elegance of the engineering, it all spoke to something deep in his nature. He excelled at understanding the hydraulic systems, the intricate network of pipes and valves and pumps that controlled everything from the diving planes to the torpedo tube doors. While other students memorized the procedures by rote, James understood the why behind each step. He could picture the flow of hydraulic fluid through the system, visualize the pressure changes, anticipate potential failure points. The USS Wahoo was commissioned in May 1942 at the Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California, a Gato-class submarine that looked like dozens of others being churned out by American shipyards, working around the clock. She was 311 feet long, displaced 1,500 tons surfaced and over 2,000 submerged, and carried a crew of 6 officers and 54 enlisted men. Her designation was SS-238, but to the men who would serve aboard her, she would simply be the boat. James Henderson reported aboard in June, joining a crew of men from every corner of America. There was Bobby O'Connor from Boston, a wiry kid with red hair and a quick wit who became James's closest friend aboard. Tommy Reeves from Georgia spoke with a drawl so thick some of the northern boys had trouble understanding him at first. Mike Chen from San Francisco was a torpedo man whose parents had come from China and who took particular satisfaction in fighting the Japanese. Old Jack Murphy, all of 35 years old, had served on destroyers for 15 years before volunteering for submarine duty. The crew was a melting pot of backgrounds and personalities, united by their willingness to face the dangers of submarine warfare. Their captain, Lieutenant Commander Marvin Kennedy, was 42 years old, a career Navy man with a reputation for being cautious and methodical. He had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1924 and had spent most of his career on surface ships before transitioning to submarines. Kennedy believed in following procedures to the letter. Every drill was performed by the book. Every decision was carefully considered. His attention to detail had kept his crew safe through their first 2 war patrols, but it had also resulted in disappointing results from a combat standpoint. The first patrol had begun in August 1942. The Wahoo departed Pearl Harbor with high hopes and a crew eager to prove themselves. They spent 6 weeks patrolling the waters around the Marshall Islands, enduring the tedium of long days underwater, the cramped conditions, the recycled air that grew increasingly foul as the days passed. They encountered 3 potential targets during that patrol. Each time, Commander Kennedy had maneuvered carefully into position, following all the established protocols for torpedo attacks. Each time, by the time they were ready to fire, the opportunity had passed. Ships changed course, escorts appeared, weather conditions shifted. They returned to Pearl Harbor having fired only 3 torpedoes, all misses. The crew was disappointed, but Kennedy reminded them that they'd all survived, and survival was the first priority. The second patrol, from October through November, had been similar. 7 torpedoes fired, countless opportunities lost to overcaution. The encounter with the Japanese freighter off the coast of Truk had been the most frustrating. Kennedy had maneuvered the Wahoo into what should have been a perfect firing position. The target was a large cargo vessel, probably carrying supplies or troops to one of the Japanese bases in the Caroline Islands. James had been at his station in the forward torpedo room, hands on the hydraulic valve control, waiting for the order. The compartment was cramped, hot, and smelled of oil and sweat. His fellow torpedomen were tense, ready for action. Commander Kennedy's voice came through the intercom, calm and measured. "Stand by forward tubes 1 and 2. I have a solution. Fire 1. James had turned the valve to open the outer torpedo tube door. This was the critical moment, when the outer door that protected the torpedo tube from the water pressure had to open fully before the torpedo could be launched. The hydraulic system was designed with safety in mind. The valve opened slowly, allowing the pressure to equalize gradually, preventing any sudden stress on the submarine's hull. 4 seconds. That's how long it took from the moment James opened the valve to the moment the outer door was fully open and the torpedo ready to launch. 4 seconds that felt like an eternity. By the time the torpedo whooshed out of the tube, propelled by compressed air, the freighter had begun a routine course change. It was just a small adjustment, probably part of a standard zigzag pattern to avoid submarine attacks, but it was enough. The torpedo, its gyroscope set for the freighter's previous course, slid past the stern, missing by perhaps 20 yards. "Missed," Lieutenant O'Kane had reported from the periscope. "Target is turning away." They'd tried to reposition for another shot, but the freighter's escorts had detected the torpedo wake and were heading toward them. Kennedy had no choice but to order a crash dive, taking the Wahoo down deep as depth charges began to explode above them. For the next 3 hours, they'd played the deadly game that submariners feared most. The submarine sat at 300 feet, silent except for the steady ping of active sonar, searching for them. Every man held his breath, trying not to make the slightest sound. Depth charges exploded at various distances, some close enough to rock the boat and send dust cascading from the pipes overhead, others farther away, but still terrifying reminders of how vulnerable they were. James had sat on the deck of the torpedo room, his back against a torpedo rack, counting the explosions. 15, 20, 30. Each one a reminder that they'd come up empty again, that their caution had cost them another opportunity. That night, unable to sleep in the cramped, humid confines of the submarine, Henderson sat at the small table in the crew's mess, sketching diagrams on the back of an old requisition form. The mess was one of the few spaces on the submarine where men could gather when off watch. It was barely large enough for 4 men to sit comfortably, with a small table bolted to the deck and benches on either side. The overhead was low enough that taller men had to duck when moving through. A single dim bulb provided light, creating more shadows than illumination. He'd been thinking about the valve system for weeks, unable to get it out of his head. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that torpedo sliding past the freighter, saw the wasted opportunity, felt the bone-shaking terror of the depth charge attack that followed. There had to be a better way. The hydraulic system for the torpedo tube doors was elegant in its simplicity. High-pressure hydraulic fluid from a reservoir flowed through a series of valves and into a cylinder connected to the outer door. As the cylinder filled, it pushed a piston that slowly opened the door against the water pressure outside. The slow rate of opening was controlled by a restriction valve that limited the flow of hydraulic fluid. This restriction was a safety feature, preventing the door from opening too quickly and creating a sudden pressure differential that could damage the tube or even the submarine's hull. But what if, James thought, they could bypass that restriction valve for just a moment? What if there was a way to allow the full flow of hydraulic fluid to reach the cylinder, opening the door in a fraction of the normal time? The idea was mechanically simple. He could install a secondary valve, essentially a bypass around the restriction valve. During normal operations, this bypass would remain closed and the system would function exactly as designed. But in combat, when every second counted, they could open the bypass valve manually, allowing unrestricted flow of hydraulic fluid to the cylinder. The outer door would snap open in less than a second. Of course, the idea came with risks. The engineers who designed the system had included the restriction valve for a reason. Opening the door too quickly could create stress on the tube. The sudden pressure change might cause a leak. Worse, if they misjudged the pressure differential when the submarine was at the wrong depth, they could cause catastrophic flooding. James ran calculations on every scrap of paper he could find. He calculated the pressure differential at various depths. He estimated the stress on the tube mounting. He analyzed the strength of the hydraulic cylinders. The math was complex, but he'd always been good with numbers. His mother's influence, perhaps, the school teacher who had made him show his work on every homework problem. The calculations showed that it should work. At typical combat depths, 50 to 75 feet, the pressure differential wouldn't be enough to cause damage. The hydraulic cylinders were rated for pressures far higher than what they'd experienced with the rapid door opening. The tube mounting could handle the stress. But should work wasn't the same as definitely will work. And on a submarine 300 feet underwater with 59 other men, depending on every system functioning properly, the difference between should and definitely could be measured in lives. He shared his idea first with Bobby O'Connor. They were cleaning the forward battery compartment, one of the least pleasant jobs on the submarine. The battery compartment housed the massive banks of batteries that powered the submarine when submerged. The batteries gave off hydrogen gas, which was vented carefully, and the compartment always smelled faintly of acid. The cleaning involved checking each battery cell, measuring the acid levels, and wiping down any corrosion. It was tedious work, but it gave them privacy to talk. Bobby listened carefully as James explained the concept. occasionally asking questions about the technical details. Bobby was sharp, one of those guys who understood machines intuitively. When James finished, Bobby set down his cleaning rag and looked at his friend seriously. "Jimmy, that's either brilliant or completely insane. Probably both." "I know it could work," James insisted, keeping his voice low so the other crew members in nearby compartments wouldn't hear. "I've run the calculations 3 times. 4 times, actually. The pressure differential won't be enough to cause damage if we do it right." "And if you're wrong?" Bobby's Boston accent made the question sound more harsh than he probably intended. James was quiet for a moment, considering. If he was wrong, the best-case scenario was that they'd blow out a tube gasket and take on some water. Bad, but manageable. Worst case, they'd crack the tube itself and flood the entire forward torpedo room. At depth, that kind of flooding was almost impossible to control. The torpedo room would fill in seconds. Men would drown. The submarine might not be able to surface in time. "If I'm wrong," James finally said, "we could blow out a tube, or worse, flood the torpedo room." Bobby nodded slowly. "That's what I figured you'd say. Question is, are you confident enough in your math to bet all our lives on it?" "I think so, yeah, I am." "You planning to take this to the old man?" Bobby asked, using the crew's nickname for their captain. "I don't know. Kennedy follows the book on everything, every procedure, every regulation. He'll probably think it's crazy. Hell, it probably is crazy." "He might," Bobby agreed, picking up his rag and returning to the battery cleaning. "But you know what else? We've been on 2 patrols and haven't sunk a single ship. The crew's getting frustrated. The officers are feeling the pressure from Pearl. We all know it. Maybe crazy is exactly what we need." Over the next 2 days, James refined his calculations and drew detailed diagrams of the proposed modification. He sketched the existing valve system, then showed how his bypass valve would integrate. He calculated the maximum safe depth for using the rapid open feature. He even designed a safety lockout that would prevent the bypass from being engaged when the submarine was too deep. The more he worked on it, the more convinced he became that it would work. But he also knew that convincing himself was the easy part. Convincing Commander Kennedy would be another matter entirely. It took James 3 more days to work up the courage to approach the captain. During those days, he second-guessed himself constantly. What if Kennedy thought he was overstepping his bounds? What if the idea really was as crazy as it seemed? What if presenting this cost him his position on the boat? But every time doubt crept in, he remembered that torpedo sliding past the freighter. He remembered the depth charges. He thought about how many opportunities they might continue to miss if nothing changed. He chose his moment carefully. Late afternoon, between watches, when Commander Kennedy would typically be in the wardroom reviewing charts and reports for their upcoming patrol. The wardroom was the officers' space, cramped like everything else on the submarine, but reserved for the commissioned officers. For an enlisted man to enter uninvited was unusual at best, a breach of protocol at worst. James stood outside the wardroom, his carefully prepared diagrams and calculations rolled up in his hand, his heart pounding so hard he was sure the captain would hear it. He took a deep breath, then knocked on the bulkhead. "Sir, Petty Officer Henderson, could I have a word?" There was a pause, long enough that James wondered if Kennedy had heard him. Then the captain's voice, tinged with surprise. "Enter!" Kennedy looked up from his charts, his weathered face showing surprise and perhaps a hint of annoyance at the interruption. The captain was not a large man, but he carried himself with the authority of his rank and his years of service. His uniform was immaculate, even in the cramped, humid conditions of the submarine. Officers and enlisted men maintained a careful distance on submarines, and it was unusual for a junior enlisted man to seek out the captain directly, especially without going through the chain of command. "Sir, I apologize for the intrusion," James began, his mouth dry. "It's about the torpedo tube hydraulic systems. I have an idea that might improve our firing efficiency. Kennedy set down his pencil and leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Go on. For the next 20 minutes, James laid out his proposal. He unrolled his diagrams on the small wardroom table, explaining the current valve system and its limitations. He showed his calculations for the pressure differentials at various depths. He detailed exactly how the bypass valve would work, the safety lockout he'd designed, the potential risks, and the mitigation strategies he'd developed. Kennedy listened without interrupting, his eyes moving from the diagrams to James's face and back again. When James finished, there was a long silence. The only sound was the ever-present hum of the submarine's systems, the gentle creak of the hull, the distant murmur of men talking in other compartments. Finally, Kennedy sat back in his chair and steeped his fingers, a gesture James would come to recognize as the captain's way of collecting his thoughts before speaking. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Henderson. You want to modify critical safety systems on my submarine. Systems that were designed by engineers with far more training and experience than you have. Systems that have been tested and proven over years of development. And you want to do this based on calculations you did on the back of a requisition form in the crew's mess. James felt his stomach drop. When Kennedy put it that way, it did sound ridiculous. Sir, I know it sounds ridiculous, Kennedy interrupted, but his tone wasn't entirely dismissive. It sounds like exactly the kind of cowboy nonsense that gets people killed. It sounds like the kind of thing that ends careers and sinks boats. He paused, studying James's face with an intensity that made the younger man want to look away. But James held his gaze, trying to project a confidence he didn't entirely feel. It also sounds, Kennedy continued, his voice softening slightly, like you've put a lot of thought into this. These calculations, are they accurate? Yes, sir. To the best of my ability. I've checked them multiple times. And you really believe this would work? You'd stake your life on it? James thought about Bobby's question, about the 59 other men aboard whose lives would depend on every system functioning properly, about his parents back in Marietta who would get a telegram if something went wrong, about all the reasons to say no. Yes, sir, I would. Kennedy was quiet for a long moment, his fingers still steepled, his eyes distant. Then he sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of command and the burden of 2 unsuccessful patrols. Henderson, I'm going to level with you. We're due for a refit in Pearl Harbor next week. When we get there, I'm being transferred. They're reassigning me to a desk job at Subpac headquarters. There was bitterness in his voice, poorly concealed. The brass thinks I'm too cautious, not aggressive enough. They've told me as much. Sir, I didn't know. Of course you didn't. It's not common knowledge yet. But here's the thing, Henderson. You might be on to something. Your calculations look sound, at least to my understanding, but I'm not going to approve your modification. James felt his hopes crashing down, all the work, all the courage it had taken to come here, for nothing. I can't approve it, Kennedy continued, because frankly, if something goes wrong, it'll be my head. And at this point in my career, with this reassignment already in motion, I can't afford that kind of black mark. But I'll tell you what I will do. He pulled out a pad of paper and began writing. I'll include your proposal in my turnover notes for the new commanding officer. I'll note that the concept has merit and deserves consideration. I'll attach your diagrams and calculations. The decision will be his to make. That's the best I can do. Fair enough? It wasn't what James had hoped for, but it was something. A chance, at least. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Henderson, Kennedy said as James was gathering his papers to leave. For what it's worth, I hope your idea works. This crew deserves some success. They work hard, they follow orders, they've earned it. If the new skipper approves this and it helps, that'll be a good thing. Yes, sir. And Henderson, next time you have an idea, go through your chief first. Chain of command exists for a reason. Yes, sir. Sorry, sir. As James left the wardroom, his hands were shaking, not from fear now, but from relief and a strange mixture of disappointment and hope. He hadn't gotten approval, but he hadn't been shut down entirely either. The door was still open, just barely. Everything now depended on whoever would take command of the Wahoo. 3 weeks later, the USS Wahoo pulled into Pearl Harbor for refit. The crew had mixed feelings about the change in command. Kennedy had kept them safe, but safe wasn't winning the war. Safe wasn't sinking Japanese ships. Safe wasn't making a difference. The day Commander Kennedy left the boat, he shook hands with every member of the crew, a gesture that surprised many of them. When he got to James, he paused. "Good luck with your idea, Henderson. I mean that."
Thank you, sir.
"And Henderson, be careful. Innovation is good, but it's not worth dying for." The new skipper, Lieutenant Commander Dudley Walker Morton, arrived 2 days later. He was different from Kennedy in almost every way. Where Kennedy was methodical and reserved, Morton was bold and charismatic. He was 36 years old, from Kentucky originally, with a southern drawl that became more pronounced when he was excited or angry. He had a reputation in the submarine service as an aggressive officer who believed in taking the fight to the enemy, a man who had chafed under more cautious commanders and was now getting his chance to run a boat his own way. Morton gathered the crew on the deck of the submarine the morning after he took command. It was a beautiful Hawaiian day, the kind that seemed impossible given the war that raged across the Pacific. The sun beat down from a cloudless sky, and Diamond Head rose majestically in the distance. The crew stood at attention, wondering what kind of captain this would be. Morton stood before them in his khaki uniform, squinting slightly in the bright sun, and when he spoke, his voice carried authority, but also a warmth that Kennedy had never quite managed. "Gentlemen, I know some of you are worried about the change in command. Change is always uncomfortable. You had a routine with Commander Kennedy, knew what to expect. Now you've got me, and you don't know what to expect." He paused, letting his eyes sweep across the assembled crew. "So let me be crystal clear about my philosophy, about what I expect from you, and what you can expect from me." He began pacing slowly back and forth, his hands clasped behind his back. "We're not out here to patrol. We're not out here to observe and report. We're not out here to be cautious and hope the war passes us by. We're out here to sink Japanese ships. Every cargo vessel we send to the bottom is one less ship carrying supplies to their troops fighting our boys on those islands. Every transport we destroy is soldiers who won't be shooting at Marines. Every warship we kill is one less gun aimed at our carriers, our destroyers, our friends." The crew was listening intently now. This was different from Kennedy's careful, regulation-focused leadership. "I'm going to ask a lot of you," Morton continued. "This won't be a safe, cautious patrol. We're going to take risks. We're going to get aggressive. We're going to put ourselves in situations that might make you uncomfortable. But I promise you this." He stopped pacing and looked directly at the crew. "If you give me your best, if you trust me and your officers, if we work as a team, we'll make a difference in this war. We'll sink ships, we'll hurt the enemy, and we'll come home with our heads high, knowing we did our part." There was a moment of silence, and then Chief Murphy, the oldest enlisted man aboard, started clapping. Within seconds, the entire crew had joined in. Morton smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "All right, get back to work. We've got a refit to finish and a war patrol to prepare for." As the crew dispersed, Morton called out, "Petty Officer Henderson, a word, please." James felt his heart rate accelerate. This was it. Morton had read Kennedy's turnover notes and was going to make a decision about the valve modification. He followed Morton and the submarine's new executive officer, Lieutenant Richard O'Kane, down the forward hatch and into the wardroom. O'Kane was another officer with a reputation for aggressiveness, a perfect match for Morton's style. He was intense, sharp-eyed, and had a way of looking at you that made you feel like he could see right through any deception. "Have a seat, Henderson," Morton said, gesturing to one of the wardroom benches. This was unusual. Enlisted men rarely sat in the wardroom, certainly not in the presence of the captain, but Morton seemed unconcerned with traditional formality. "I've read your proposal about the hydraulic valve modification," Morton said without preamble, pulling out the diagrams James had prepared weeks earlier. Commander Kennedy thought it was too risky. He included it in his turnover notes, but recommended against implementation. I think he might have been wrong. I think it might be exactly what we need. James tried to keep his expression neutral, professional, but inside his heart was racing. "Sir?" "Walk me through it again," Morton said, spreading the diagrams on the small wardroom table. "Assume I know submarines, but pretend I'm skeptical. Convince me." For the next 45 minutes, James went through his explanation once more, this time with more confidence than he'd had with Kennedy. He described the current system, its limitations, the opportunities they were losing. He showed his calculations for the pressure differentials, explained the safety lockout he'd designed, detailed the installation procedure. O'Kane asked technical questions, probing for weaknesses in the plan. What happens if the bypass valve fails in the open position? You'd have no restriction at all on the flow. "Sir, I've designed the valve with a fail-safe mechanism. If it fails closed. The system defaults back to the standard configuration." "What about at deeper depths? What if we need to use this below 100 feet? "The safety lockout prevents engagement of the bypass below 85 feet. It's a mechanical lockout, not electronic, so it can't be overridden accidentally." "What if an inexperienced crew member engages the bypass at the wrong time?" "The bypass is only in the forward torpedo room, and it requires 2 separate actions to engage. You have to unlock it first, then operate it. It's designed so it can't be activated accidentally." The questions went on, each one testing a different aspect of the design. James answered them all, supported by the calculations and analysis he'd done over countless hours in the crew's mess and the forward torpedo room. When the questions finally stopped, Morton looked at O'Kane. "What do you think, Dick?" O'Kane was silent for a moment, studying the diagrams one more time. "I think it could work, Captain. The math checks out. The safety features seem adequate, and God knows we need an edge out there. The Japanese aren't sitting still. Their anti-submarine tactics are getting better every month. We need every advantage we can get." Morton nodded slowly, then looked at James. "Here's what we're going to do, Henderson. You'll have 3 days to make your modifications while we're in port. But you're not doing it alone. You'll work with the base engineering staff. I want Chief Engineer Walter Hawkins and his team to check every aspect of your work. We're not going to bypass safety entirely. We're going to add a manual override that can only be engaged during combat situations, and only with proper authorization from the con. If the base engineers sign off on it, we'll test it in shallow water before our next patrol. If the tests work, we'll use it in combat. If anything seems off, if there's any indication of a problem, we go back to the standard system immediately. Agreed?" "Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir." "Good." Morton stood, indicating the meeting was over. "One more thing, Henderson. If this works, if we start sinking ships because of this modification, I'm putting you in for a commendation. Your innovation could save American lives and cost the enemy dearly. That deserves recognition." He paused at the wardroom door. "But if it fails, if something goes wrong, and we have casualties because of this system, that's on all of us. On you for designing it, on the base engineers for approving it, on Lieutenant O'Kane and me for authorizing it. We're all in this together. Understand?" "Yes, sir, I understand." "Good. Get to work." Henderson worked around the clock for the next 3 days. The base engineering team was skeptical at first, but as they reviewed his work, their skepticism turned to grudging respect. Chief Engineer Walter Hawkins, a gruff 30-year veteran, finally signed off on the modifications. "I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen the calculations myself," Hawkins told Morton. "The kid knows his stuff. It's risky, but it should work." The shallow water tests went flawlessly. With the new override system, the outer doors snapped open in under a second, and the torpedoes launched with precision. The submarine showed no signs of stress or damage. Morton was elated. "Gentlemen, I think we might have just given ourselves a real advantage," he told his officers. "Now let's go find out." The USS Wahoo left Pearl Harbor on January 16, 1943, headed for the waters around New Guinea. The mood aboard was different from previous patrols. There was nervous energy, a sense that something significant was about to happen. Henderson's modification would get its first real test on January 24th. The Wahoo was cruising on the surface in the early morning hours when the lookout spotted smoke on the horizon. Morton ordered battle stations, and the submarine dove to periscope depth. Through the periscope, O'Kane identified the target as a Japanese destroyer escort, zigzagging across the water in a standard patrol pattern. This was exactly the kind of target that had eluded them on previous patrols, too fast and too maneuverable for the slow torpedo tube door operation. "Range 3,000 yards, O'Kane called out, his eye pressed to the periscope. "He's making about 18 knots, course changing every 40 seconds. Morton made his decision. "We're going to get close, 1,500 yards. At that range, even with his zigzag pattern, we can't miss." It was an aggressive move, bringing the submarine within easy detection range. But Morton was betting that surprise would be their ally. 1,500 yards, Captain. "Stand by forward tubes 1 and 2. Henderson, your modification ready?" In the forward torpedo room, Henderson's hands were steady as he gripped the manual override valve he'd installed. "Ready, sir." "Target is turning to port. Angle on the bow, 30 degrees. I have a solution." "Fire one!" Henderson yanked the manual override. The outer door snapped open with a clang that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space. The torpedo whooshed out of the tube. "Fire two!" Again, the instant response. The second torpedo was away before the destroyer could even react to the first. 45 seconds of agonizing wait. Then a tremendous explosion rocked through the water. The crew could feel it through the hull. Then a second explosion, even larger than the first. "Target is breaking up," O'Kane reported, unable to keep the excitement from his voice. "She's going down fast. We got her, Captain. We got her." The crew erupted in cheers. Henderson felt Bobby clap him on the back so hard he nearly lost his balance. "That's one for the good guys, Jimmy. Your crazy idea actually worked." But Morton wasn't done. Over the next 2 weeks, the Wahoo went on a rampage through Japanese-controlled waters. Using Henderson's quick-opening valve system, they were able to attack targets that other submarines would have considered too difficult or too risky. The instant response time gave them a crucial advantage in every engagement. On January 26th, they sank a large cargo freighter carrying supplies to Japanese bases in New Guinea. The ship went down so fast that the escort vessels didn't even have time to mount a proper depth charge attack before the Wahoo slipped away into the depths. On February 1st, they encountered a convoy of 4 ships with 2 escorts. In a daring surface attack at night, Morton brought the Wahoo between the convoy columns and fired at nearly point-blank range. Henderson's modification allowed them to fire 8 torpedoes in less than 2 minutes, an unheard-of rate of fire. 3 ships went to the bottom. But success brought its own challenges. The Japanese Navy was now actively hunting for the submarine that had wreaked such havoc in their waters. The crew knew they were on borrowed time. The close call came on February 7th. The Wahoo was running on the surface at night, recharging batteries, when a Japanese patrol plane appeared out of the darkness. The alarm sounded, and the crew raced to dive the submarine. They made it down to 80 feet before the first bomb hit. The explosion was like being inside a bell when someone strikes it with a hammer. The lights went out. Men were thrown against bulkheads. In the forward torpedo room, Henderson hit his head on a valve and felt warm blood trickling down his face. Emergency lighting flickered on. Damage report. Morton's voice was calm over the intercom, but Henderson could hear the strain underneath. The submarine had survived, but just barely. The stern planes were damaged, making it difficult to maintain depth. A hydraulic line had ruptured in the engine room, and they were leaving an oil slick on the surface. They needed to make repairs, but they were deep in enemy waters, with a patrol plane circling above. For the next 6 hours, the Wahoo played a deadly game of cat and mouse. The crew worked in near silence, making repairs while trying to stay undetected. Henderson, despite his bleeding head wound, helped patch the hydraulic line, his hands steady, even as the submarine creaked and groaned under the pressure of depth changes. Finally, after the longest 6 hours of their lives, the soundman reported that the patrol plane had moved off. Morton brought the submarine to periscope depth and surveyed the area. Empty ocean. They'd survived. That night, with the submarine running on the surface under a blanket of stars, Morton called Henderson to the bridge. The young machinist's mate climbed up through the hatch, breathing in the fresh air after hours in the stale, tense atmosphere below. "Hell of a day, Henderson," Morton said, not taking his eyes off the horizon. "Yes, sir. Your modification saved us today. Those quick torpedo launches allowed us to dive faster. Every second counted." "Just doing my job, sir." Morton finally looked at him. "It's more than that. You saw a problem and you figured out a solution. You took a risk proposing it. That takes courage." He paused. "We've sunk 8 ships on this patrol. 8 ships that won't be supplying Japanese troops. 8 ships that won't be transporting soldiers. You helped make that possible." Henderson didn't know what to say. He simply nodded. "Get that head wound looked at," Morton said. "And Henderson, thank you." The USS Wahoo returned to Pearl Harbor in mid-February 1943 as heroes. Their patrol had been the most successful American submarine patrol of the war to that point. Morton was hailed as an aggressive, brilliant commander. O'Kane was recognized for his targeting skills. And Henderson received a Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal for technical innovation. More importantly, his valve modification was studied by Submarine Command, and similar systems began to be installed on other submarines in the fleet. What had started as a ridiculous idea, sketched on the back of a requisition form, became standard procedure. But the cost of war was never far away. The Wahoo went on to complete several more successful patrols, with Henderson's system playing a crucial role in each one. The submarine and Commander Morton became legends in the submarine service. In October 1943, the USS Wahoo left Pearl Harbor for her 7th war patrol. She was sent to the Sea of Japan, one of the most dangerous areas in the Pacific, entered through narrow straits that the Japanese heavily defended. It was a mission that required exceptional skill and courage. The submarine was supposed to return in early November. The crew was confident. They'd proven themselves time and again. They'd become one of the most successful submarines in the Pacific Fleet. She never did return. On October 11, 1943, the USS Wahoo was transiting the La Pérouse Strait between the Japanese island of Hokkaido and the Soviet island of Sakhalin. Japanese patrol aircraft had been alerted to submarine activity in the area. At approximately 9 in the morning, a Japanese aircraft spotted the Wahoo on the surface, probably running her diesel engines to charge batteries before the next dive. The crew scrambled to dive, but they were caught in shallow water with limited room to maneuver. The Japanese aircraft made multiple bombing runs. The Wahoo, true to her aggressive nature, tried to fight back with her deck guns, but the situation was hopeless. The bombs found their mark. The submarine was fatally damaged and sank in shallow water. All 79 men were lost. Commander Morton, who had led the Wahoo to legendary status, Lieutenant O'Kane, who had been reassigned to the Wahoo for this patrol as a gesture of respect and brotherhood, Bobby O'Connor, who had transferred back to be with his friend for one more patrol, and Petty Officer James Henderson, the young machinist's mate from Marietta, Ohio, who had changed submarine warfare with what his first captain had called a ridiculous idea. The loss of the Wahoo was felt throughout the submarine service. She had been more than just a successful boat. She had been a symbol of what aggressive, innovative tactics could achieve. Morton had been a mentor to many young officers. O'Kane would go on to achieve legendary status before his own capture late in the war. And Henderson's valve modification had been adopted by the entire submarine fleet, becoming standard operating procedure. James Henderson's parents received the telegram on a cold November morning in Marietta. His mother collapsed when she read it. His father stood on their porch, looking out at the Muskingum River, tears streaming down his face, and wondered what his son's last moments had been like. Had it been quick? Had he suffered? Had he known how much they loved him, how proud they were? They would never know that their son had helped change the course of the war. The commendation Morton had promised was approved posthumously, along with a Purple Heart. The Navy sent them his medals along with a letter explaining that Petty Officer Henderson's technical innovation had contributed significantly to the success of the submarine campaign in the Pacific. The letter was kind but formal, unable to capture the real impact of what James had done. Bobby O'Connor's best friend from Boston, Mike Chen, survived the war, serving on another submarine. After the war, he made it his mission to visit the families of his lost friends. He traveled to Marietta in the spring of 1946 and spent an afternoon with the Hendersons, telling them stories about their son that the Navy's formal letters could never convey. He told them about James's dedication to his work, how he'd spend his off-watch hours in the torpedo room, studying the systems, looking for ways to improve them. He told them about the night James had first shared his idea, how excited and nervous he'd been. He told them about the day the first ship went down, how the entire crew had cheered, how James had been so overwhelmed he'd had tears in his eyes. "Your son was brilliant," Mike told them, sitting in their modest living room with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. "But more than that, he was brave. Not just the kind of brave that faces enemy fire, though he did that too, but the kind of brave that speaks up when you have an idea, even when you're worried people will think you're crazy. The kind of brave that takes responsibility, that says, 'I believe in this enough to stake my life on it.'" James's mother wiped her eyes. Did he suffer at the end? Mike was quiet for a moment. He'd learned what happened to the Wahoo from intelligence reports after the war. The attack had been swift and brutal, but he also knew what this mother needed to hear. "No, ma'am, it was quick, and he was with his friends, with many respected, doing the job he loved. That's more than a lot of people get." In the years after the war, historians and naval experts studied the USS Wahoo's record in detail. The submarine had sunk 21 enemy ships totaling over 72,000 tons, making it one of the most successful American submarines of World War II. Analysis showed that many of those kills would not have been possible without the quick-opening valve system that Henderson had designed. The innovation spread beyond just submarine torpedo tubes. The principle of having a rapid override system for time-critical operations while maintaining normal safety protocols for routine operations was adopted in other naval systems. Engineers studied Henderson's elegant solution, the way he'd managed to increase combat effectiveness without compromising safety during non-combat operations. But perhaps Henderson's greatest legacy wasn't the mechanical innovation itself, it was the example he set. Throughout the submarine service, throughout the Navy, his story became a reminder that good ideas can come from anywhere, that innovation isn't limited to engineers in laboratories or officers at headquarters. that sometimes the person closest to a problem is the person best positioned to solve it. After the war, when the Navy established its submarine school in a permanent facility in Groton, Connecticut, they included Henderson's story in the curriculum, not as a technical case study, though that was part of it, but as an example of the kind of thinking the Navy needed from all its personnel. Today, there's a small plaque at the Submarine Force Museum in Groton. It's in a quiet corner, easy to miss if you're not looking for it. The plaque commemorates the crew of the USS Wahoo and specifically mentions Petty Officer James Henderson's technical innovation. Visitors often pause at the display, reading about the young man who changed submarine warfare with what his first captain had called the most ridiculous idea he'd ever heard. Next to the plaque is a photograph, one of the few that exists of the Wahoo's crew. James Henderson is in the back row, third from the left, squinting slightly in the Hawaiian sun. He's 22 years old in the photo, looks even younger. There's a slight smile on his face, the kind of expression that suggests he knows a secret but isn't ready to share it yet. Maybe he'd just gotten approval for his valve modification. Maybe he was thinking about the upcoming patrol. Maybe he was just happy to be with his friends, serving his country, doing something that mattered. The museum also displays a replica of the valve system Henderson designed. It's a teaching tool used to show visitors and students how a simple mechanical innovation can have profound effects. The placard next to it explains the technical details, but it also includes a quote from one of Commander Morton's patrol reports. Petty Officer Henderson's modification has proven invaluable in combat operations. It has allowed us to engage targets that would otherwise have escaped. His initiative and technical skill reflect the highest standards of the naval service. War brings out the worst in humanity, but it also sometimes brings out the best. It reveals courage in unexpected places. It shows us that heroes come in all forms, not just those who charge into battle with guns blazing, but those who think, who innovate, who refuse to accept that something can't be improved. James Henderson's story reminds us that one person, regardless of rank or position, can make a difference. That a good idea, carefully thought out and boldly presented, can change outcomes. That courage isn't just about facing enemy fire, it's also about standing up in front of your commanding officer and saying, "Sir, I think there's a better way." The USS Wahoo and her crew rest at the bottom of the Sea of Japan, more than 300 feet below the surface, in the cold, dark water of the La Perouse Strait. Japanese authorities confirmed the wreck's location in 2006, using sonar to identify the submarine's hull. The wreck is considered a war grave, protected from disturbance, a silent memorial to the men who served aboard her. But the legacy of those men, and particularly of James Henderson, lives on. The valves that he modified, the principle that innovation and courage can come from anywhere, the example he set for generations of sailors who came after him. These things endured long after the guns fell silent. In Marietta, Ohio, James Henderson is memorialized on the town's war monument, his name carved in granite alongside the other local men who gave their lives in World War II. Every Memorial Day, the town holds a ceremony and someone reads the names of the fallen. When they reach Henderson's name, they always add Technical Innovator, United States Navy, USS Wahoo. His modification of submarine torpedo tube systems contributed significantly to the Allied victory in the Pacific. His parents are buried in the town cemetery not far from where James played as a child. On their shared headstone is a small inscription below their names: Parents of Petty Officer James Henderson, USN, lost aboard USS Wahoo, October 11, 1943. Their son's courage and innovation helped win the war. In a cramped submarine, in the middle of a war, a young machinist's mate with a wrench and an idea helped change history. He never came home to the parades and celebrations. He never got to tell his story to his children or grandchildren. He never received the recognition he deserved during his lifetime, but his contribution mattered. It saved lives, it sank enemy ships, it helped win a war. And sometimes that's what heroism really looks like. Not glory or fame, but simply doing what needs to be done, seeing what needs to be fixed, and having the courage to try even when everyone tells you your idea is ridiculous. James Henderson did that. He did his job, he served his country, and he made a difference. In the end, what more can any of us hope to do? The next time you hear about a major innovation or breakthrough, remember that it might have started with someone like James Henderson, someone young, someone without impressive credentials, someone who simply saw a problem and refused to accept that it couldn't be solved, someone who had the courage to speak up, to present an idea, to take a risk in service of something larger than themselves. That's the real lesson of James Henderson's story. Innovation doesn't require genius, though Henderson was certainly brilliant. It doesn't require rank or authority, though having a commanding officer willing to listen certainly helped. What it requires is the willingness to see problems clearly, to think creatively about solutions, and to have the courage to speak up, even when the idea seems ridiculous. In October 1943, the Pacific Ocean claimed the USS Wahoo and all 79 souls aboard. But the spirit of innovation, courage, and dedication that James Henderson embodied lives on. It lives on in every sailor who refuses to accept "that's how we've always done it" as a good enough answer. It lives on in every person who sees a better way and finds the courage to propose it. It lives on in all of us who believe that one person, with determination and ingenuity, can change the world. James Henderson was 23 years old, a machinist's mate from a small town in Ohio, when he changed submarine warfare forever. He didn't live to see the end of the war, didn't live to see his idea adopted throughout the fleet, didn't live to receive the recognition he earned. But his legacy endures, a reminder that heroism takes many forms and that sometimes the most important battles are won not with weapons, but with wrenches, determination, and the courage to believe that ridiculous ideas sometimes turn out to be exactly what the world needs.